Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications to receive all updates. That way you won't miss any macabre adventures or surprising revelations. And we want to know more about you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Every message is important and helps us create stories that are even closer to you. Who knows? Maybe your city or country will appear in the next investigation. The sun was setting behind the San Jose hills, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple. Sarah Whitman observed the facade of the old Winchester mansion with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. The building stood like a labyrinth of untold stories, windows that didn't correspond to rooms, doors that led to solid walls, staircases that ended at the ceiling. To any ordinary visitor, the place seemed absurdly disjointed. To Sarah, it was a promise of hidden discoveries. She had heard the rumors. The widow, Sarah Winchester, wealthy heiress to the Winchester fortune, had supposedly built every hallway and every room as a way to protect herself from the hauntings of those killed by her family's guns. Neighbors avoided approaching after nightfall, and stories of workers disappearing or going insane during construction circulated quietly through the neighborhood. Sarah Whitman, however, was an investigative journalist, and her instincts told her there was more than superstition at play. As he walked along the stone path leading to the main entrance, he felt the subtle chill of something invisible. It wasn't just the autumn wind, there was something in the mansion walls, as if the house itself were breathing. A door creaked behind her, and Sarah turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the echo of footsteps that weren't hers. The antagonist of the story wasn't a person, but rather the environment itself, a mansion that seemed to live and shape anyone who dared enter its labyrinth. Every corridor was designed to confuse, every door seemed to test the courage of whoever passed through. Sarah knew she needed to document everything, but the mansion didn't make it easy. Dead-end staircases, windows overlooking empty rooms, and locked doors without keys. Everything seemed designed to test the sanity of any intruder. Upon entering, she noticed the contrast with the outside world. Outside the mansion, the neighborhood was peaceful, houses lined up, lights on. Inside, it was another reality. Shadows stretched from unexpected angles. Walls seemed to move as she advanced, and the echo of her own footsteps seemed to multiply, as if other footsteps were following her. Sarah took a deep breath and began to systematically explore each corridor, mentally noting each architectural irregularity. As she walked, she found seemingly mundane objects, but strangely out of place. A mirror leaning against the floor, reflecting not what was in front of it, but another part of the room. An overturned chair, as if someone had left in a hurry. Yellowed papers with notes in elegant handwriting, mentioning times, names, and incomprehensible symbols. Sarah began to feel that every detail of the house was a message. But from whom? And for what purpose? In a particularly narrow hallway, the feeling of being watched intensified. She heard an almost inaudible whisper, indistinct amidst the creaking of the wood and the rustling of the wind through a broken window. Sarah stopped. The whisper seemed to say her name. A shiver ran down her spine, and for a moment she thought of turning back, but curiosity, her strongest impulse as a journalist, kept her moving forward. The mansion, with all its architectural strangeness, functioned as a living character. It directed, confused, tested, and punished. Each of Sarah's steps was not merely a physical advance, but an immersion into a psychological labyrinth that threatened to dissolve the line between reality and hallucination. She realized she needed to remain objective, to record every anomaly, but the more she explored, the harder it became to distinguish between what was built by human hands and what seemed to emerge of its own accord from the house. And then, At the top of a staircase that seemed to lead nowhere, Sarah found a half-open door. On the other side, dim lights illuminated a corridor that wasn't on the mansion's map, nor in any historical record she possessed. A strange aroma hung in the air, sweet and metallic at the same time. The mystery deepened, and Sarah realized that, upon crossing that door, there would be no turning back. Every decision within that mansion had unexpected consequences, and what seemed like mere curiosity was beginning to transform into survival. She took a deep breath, felt her pulse quicken, and stepped forward, aware that she was entering territory where nothing was as it seemed. The Winchester mansion was not just a building, it was a living enigma, testing the limits of anyone who dared to cross its corridors. And Sarah Whitman was about to discover that some doors should not be opened, and some answers might be more terrifying than any myth told about the widow and her obsession. The following day brought a grey light that seemed to drag the Winchester mansion itself into a darker dimension. Sarah Whitman returned to the location with photographic equipment and a notepad, determined to map every corridor, every door, every irregularity that had caught her attention the previous day. But the more she observed, the more the mansion seemed to resist categorization. Curved walls that seemed to breathe, doors that shifted when you weren't looking directly at them. Sarah wasn't alone that day. A former caretaker, Thomas Hargrove, who had worked maintaining the mansion for decades, agreed to accompany her. Tall, with broad shoulders and a weary expression, Thomas knew every structural detail of the house, but not its mysterious nuances. He spoke with almost reverent care about the widow Winchester. Mrs. Winchester believed the house needed to grow, that every hallway was a shield. Many never understood, but she was convinced she was protecting her family from the consequences of a blood-stained fortune. Sarah wrote down every word, trying to understand the balance between obsession and paranoia. Thomas led her through corridors not shown on any map, revealing hidden rooms, blank windows, and staircases leading to false ceilings. He recounted small stories, like tools that disappeared without explanation, paintings that moved, whispers heard by workers at night. Sarah realized that for Thomas, these stories were routine. For her, they were fragments of a larger enigma. As they explored, Sarah began to notice subtle patterns in the hallways and doorways, discreetly engraved symbols, numbers hidden in frames, inscriptions that seemed to form coded messages. The mansion was not just a physical labyrinth, but a mental puzzle, testing anyone who dared to understand its logic. Each discovery increased Sarah's fascination, but also the feeling that something was watching her. Another character emerged as a key figure in the investigation, Dr. Elias Monroe, a local historian specializing in the Civil War and influential California families of the 19th century. He brought old documents, letters, and diaries detailing the rise of the Winchester family, their political and commercial connections, and accounts of the widow's obsession with relentless building. Monroe explained that the mansion was not merely eccentric architecture, it was a manifestation of guilt and fear, transforming the physical space into a reflection of its builder's disturbed mind. Sarah realized that every corridor, every staircase that ended abruptly, and every door that led to nowhere had an implicit meaning. It wasn't just confusion or superstition, it was a coded message, a map of fears and precautions. And the more she understood, the more questions arose. Why did some rooms remain untouched for decades? Why were certain doors never opened? Were there darker intentions behind each architectural decision? The presence of Thomas and Dr. Monroe added layers to the narrative. Thomas, with his practical experience, balanced the realistic perspective. Monroe, with his historical insight, provided cultural and social context to the ongoing construction. And Sarah, curious and inquisitive, was the connecting thread linking past and present, mystery and reality. While exploring the second floor, Sarah found an old diary hidden behind a movable bookcase. The handwriting was elegant but nervous, and the pages recounted nighttime encounters, sudden construction decisions, and the widow Winchester's feverish dreams. Each line reinforced the idea that the mansion was not just architecture, it was a living organism, shaped by obsessions, guilt, and fear. The city of San Jose, with its blend of tradition and modernity, also contributed to the setting. The neighborhood observed the mansion with curiosity and apprehension. Tales of lost tourists or missing workers became local legends. The Californian culture of the time, marked by expansionism and the pursuit of fortune, contrasted sharply with the widow's isolation, creating tension between the outside world and the claustrophobic reality of the house. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah felt the weight of time and space within the mansion. The labyrinth was not only physically confusing, but mentally so. Each corridor concealed a story, each door hinted at a secret. And despite the fear, there was a silent urgency, the need to understand before the labyrinth swallowed them whole. At the end of the day, Sarah, Thomas, and Monroe left the mansion with more questions than answers, but certain that they were facing something extraordinary. The Winchester Mystery House was not just a place of architectural strangeness, but a territory of intertwined stories, fears, and obsessions, waiting to be unveiled by those brave enough to cross its corridors. The following days transformed Sarah's visit to the Winchester Mystery House into a constant test of perception and courage. Each corridor explored seemed to take on a life of its own, reacting to her team's advance. Doors that had previously seemed motionless now creaked or slammed shut on their own, staircases vanished into the distance, and long corridors had echoes that confused the ear. The mansion was no longer just a setting, it was an active antagonist, defying any attempt at control or rational analysis. The first clear tension arose when Thomas insisted on inspecting an old section of the attic. He had avoided that space for years, claiming it was unstable and that some workers had sworn to hear voices and see shadows. Sarah, skeptical but determined, insisted on going ahead. As they climbed the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, the metallic smell more intense. Thomas walked ahead, but his face showed a mixture of apprehension and determination. When they opened the attic door, they found a narrow corridor that stretched into an unknown space. It was unlike anything they had ever seen: low ceilings, sloping walls, and a series of doors that didn't match any historical maps. Sarah immediately realized they were dealing with something deeper than simple architectural strangeness. There was a pattern, a code that defied logic and chronology. As they walked forward, they heard footsteps behind them. Not ordinary footsteps, but an irregular rhythm, as if someone were watching them at intervals, always emerging from a different corridor. Thomas stopped abruptly. "This isn't normal. I've never heard of anything like this," he said in a low voice. "We're not the only ones here." Sarah felt her heart race, but she remained calm. She knew that any impulsive reaction could compromise her investigation. She suggested splitting the team to map the space, but even that idea seemed to incite the atmosphere. Doors were closing on their own, as if the mansion were deciding who could proceed and who could not. The conflict deepened when Dr. Monroe discovered a hidden room behind a false wall, filled with the widow's diaries and documents. Some recounted mystical experiences, others described encounters with seemingly unreal figures, non-existent workers, voices in the dark, figures that watched without moving. Monroe was impressed, but cautious. "We can't rule out that this is just documented paranoia," he said, "but there is consistency between accounts from different eras." Sarah realized that the mansion had layers that extended beyond its architecture. It shaped the perception of anyone who dared to explore it. Every detail they discovered, doors that changed position, corridors that led nowhere, documents that suggested unseen presences, intensified the team's internal conflict. Thomas, accustomed to routine, felt challenged. Monroe, rational and historically minded, began to question his own logic. Sarah struggled to maintain objectivity, while fear weighed heavily on every step. The first crisis occurred when, in a seemingly normal hallway, Thomas disappeared for a few minutes. Sarah and Monroe frantically searched for him, finding him minutes later in a room that didn't exist on the maps. He seemed confused, unable to explain how he had gotten there. The tension increased. The mansion not only challenged their physical movements, but also their perception of time and space. The emotional pressure began to intensify, creating small conflicts between the characters. Thomas, shaken, accused Sarah of pushing him into unnecessary danger. Monroe, concerned about the group's sanity, questioned whether they would continue exploring without safety measures. Sarah, determined to document the truth, insisted that only by understanding the mansion could they decipher its secrets. Each argument reflected the growing complexity of the conflict. It was not just about confronting the bizarre architecture, but about surviving the psychological effect the house had on them. Among the physical and emotional obstacles, Sarah discovered patterns that seemed to indicate that certain doors could only be opened at specific times, based on cycles of light or presence. The mansion wasn't random. It had its own rules, almost like a conscious organism, testing and selecting who could proceed. Each wrong decision increased the tension. Corridors that closed, doors that disappeared, staircases that led to dead ends. The team began to realize they were trapped in a cycle. The more they tried to map or control the situation, the more the mansion adapted, revealing new traps. Tensions between them increased, but a growing connection also emerged. They needed to trust each other, even when the mansion seemed to conspire against that trust. The main conflict was clear. It wasn't just Sarah's curiosity versus the strangeness of the mansion. It was a psychological and physical confrontation between the human and the environment where traditional logic failed. Each discovery brought new questions and reinforced the feeling that whatever inhabited or animated the Winchester Mystery House was watching, testing, shaping the team's every move. As night fell, they gathered in a dimly lit room. Sarah, exhausted, looked at Thomas and Monroe. "Tomorrow we'll go deeper. We don't know what we'll find, but we need to keep going. The answer is here, somewhere," she said firmly, even though she felt the chill of uncertainty down her spine. The labyrinthine Winchester mansion offered more than just physical obstacles. It manipulated emotions, relationships, and decisions, making every step a risky choice. The conflict's development was complete. The mansion was no longer a passive setting. It was an active antagonist, and the characters were deeply immersed in its macabre challenge. The following morning, the tension between Sarah, Thomas, and Dr. Monroe was more evident than ever. The previous day's experiences had left scars, both physical and emotional, and every hallway of the Winchester mansion seemed to amplify old fears. But the investigation needed to move forward, and new subplots began to unfold, linking the Winchester widow's past to the team's present actions. One of the first complications arose when Sarah found old letters exchanged between the widow and the mansion's supposed builders. In one of them, a curious note detailed nighttime meetings of workers who were never seen again. This sparked a new obsession in Sarah: to uncover the fate of these men. Thomas, who knew oral histories of missing workers, began to recount local rumors that indicated strange practices, something beyond mere superstition or obsession. This subplot brought emotional tension. The team needed to decide how far they would risk going to seek answers, balancing curiosity and safety. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe noticed recurring patterns in the notes and diaries, indicating that the widow Winchester may have intentionally left clues to test future visitors to the mansion. This created an intellectual subplot in which the team attempted to decipher codes and signs scattered throughout the corridors and rooms, often leading them to doors that didn't exist on any official map. The tension mounted. Each discovery seemed to raise more questions than it answered, reinforcing the idea that the mansion was a living labyrinth with its own rules. At the same time, interpersonal conflicts arose. Thomas, increasingly shaken by the erratic behavior at the mansion, began to question Sarah's leadership. In a heated argument, he accused her of putting everyone in danger. "It's not just curiosity. The house, it's testing us, deceiving us. I don't know how much longer I can continue," he said, looking at the corridors that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Sarah felt the tension, but remained firm in her determination. "Thomas, if we don't investigate, we'll never understand what really happened here. We need to face this together." This emotional subplot reinforced the psychological conflict, showing that the pressure of the mansion directly influenced human relationships. Every individual choice was put to the test, and small failures in communication or trust resulted in immediate consequences, such as doors closing unexpectedly or corridors changing direction. While exploring the second floor, the team found a hidden room behind a false panel, filled with furniture covered in old cloths and papers. Among them, Sarah discovered photographs of unknown people, faces of workers, visitors, and family members who had frequented the mansion over the years. The disturbing detail was that some faces seemed to move in the images, as if the camera itself had captured more than just still images. This discovery added a subtle supernatural layer to the narrative, without resorting to fantastical elements, maintaining the macabre realism of the plot. Time pressure also came into play. Each hour of the day seemed to alter the perception of the corridors. The sun, shining through the windows, generated shadows that changed position, illuminating symbols engraved on doors and walls. The team realized that certain doors could only be opened when the light fell in a specific way, transforming the exploration into a puzzle that depended on the passage of time and meticulous observation. This dynamic increased the narrative tension, creating a sense of urgency without resorting to accidents or direct attacks. Meanwhile, Sarah began writing detailed notes about her own perceptions and feelings. She recorded every pattern she observed, every sensation of being followed or watched, and every emotional reaction from the staff. This introspective subplot, though short, allowed the reader to understand the psychological impact of the mansion without becoming a prolonged reflection that slowed the pace. At the end of the day, the team discovered a staircase that seemed to lead to a hidden basement. The air became humid, and a stronger metallic smell enveloped the environment. The combination of historical discoveries, visual clues, and human tensions created a moment of maximum pressure. They needed to decide whether to descend immediately or wait for daylight. Each decision took on strategic and emotional weight, intertwining all the subplots: the search for the past, the resolution of architectural patterns, and the maintenance of group cohesion. Sarah looked at Thomas and Monroe, realizing the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about physical survival, but balancing fear, curiosity, and rationality in the face of an antagonist who seemed alive. Each subplot, historical, emotional, and psychological, converged on the understanding that the Winchester Mystery House was not merely a physical labyrinth, but a network of meticulous tests designed to confuse, challenge, and observe. When they left to rest, the mansion remained silent, yet permeated with unsolved mysteries. The subplots created, the disappearances of workers, the widow's codes, the group's internal tensions, and the temporal cycle of the corridors, formed a complex web, ensuring that each step forward had new layers of suspense and unpredictability. The investigation was far from over, But each discovery strengthened the awareness that they were dealing with something that transcended any simple logic. It was a quiet, cold night in San Jose. The team returned to the Winchester mansion, driven by a mixture of determination and anxiety. Moonlight streamed through jagged windows, casting shadows that contorted across the floor. Sarah Whitman felt that each step inside the mansion brought her closer to something that could change everything. Thomas, still shaken by his temporary disappearance in the attic, walked cautiously, while Dr. Monroe analyzed patterns in the newly discovered journals, trying to predict where the next secret door might appear. The turning point came when Sarah found a door she had never seen before, hidden behind a thick curtain. It was small, almost imperceptible, with engraved symbols that didn't match any others in the house. Thomas hesitated, but Sarah, guided by curiosity, turned the doorknob. The door opened onto a hallway completely different from anything they had explored. Black walls, polished wooden floors that creaked under every step, and a feeling of weightlessness that made objects seem to float lightly. As they moved forward, they began to hear clear, articulate whispers that didn't come from any familiar corridor. The voice sounded familiar, almost as if he were trying to call Sarah by name. The feeling of being watched intensified with each step. Then they found a room at the end of the corridor, illuminated by a diffuse light, coming from a skylight that seemed to float without structure. Inside, a series of antique mirrors reflected not only the staff, but images of people they had never seen. Workers, visitors, and even the widow Winchester herself, young and alive in some kind of vivid illusion. The shock came when Dr. Monroe realized that the images in the mirrors changed as they moved. Figures gestured, looked directly at them, and seemed to move among the reflections. Thomas recoiled, disturbed. This isn't normal. Sarah, we need to get out of here, she said, her voice trembling. Sarah hesitated. The journalist's fascination competed with palpable fear. But then, something even more unexpected happened. One of the mirrors reflected not only them, but an entire room that no one on the team knew, with a staircase leading down to a basement filled with files, antique furniture, and documents that looked freshly handled. The mansion revealed its deepest layer, a hidden part that manipulated space, perception, and time in ways that no historical record had ever captured. Sarah moved forward cautiously and noticed a disturbing coincidence. All the symbols engraved on the secret doors, walls, and diaries corresponded exactly to the symbols on the mirrors. Every door they had previously opened, every corridor that had confused them, was part of a three-dimensional map hidden within that room. The mansion not only tested visitors, it led the curious to a final revelation, a truth that had been kept hidden for decades. It was then that Sarah found a locked wooden box with the initial S engraved on it. Inside were letters and photographs that directly connected the widow Winchester to the disappearance of workers and the relentless construction. The widow not only believed she was protecting herself and her fortune, but had intentionally documented traps and clues that allowed only the most perceptive to discover the truth. And the truth was disturbing. Many missing workers had been victims of covered-up accidents, but the widow kept detailed records, as if the house were both a sanctuary and a silent court, judging who deserved to understand her secrets. Thomas remained utterly silent, absorbing the gravity of the discovery, while Dr. Monroe attempted to reconcile historical evidence with what they saw before them. The mansion had transformed into something beyond architecture. It was an intelligent organism, manipulating perception, logic, and emotions, as if testing the team before revealing its final secret. The turning point came when Sarah realized the mirrors weren't mere reflections. They were visual portals, showing past and present events simultaneously. She saw the widow Winchester herself, circling empty corridors, inspecting each room with the obsession that documented the diaries. And then a cold certainty took hold of Sarah. The mansion not only contained stories, it stored living memories, and the widow's own consciousness seemed to float between its walls. The team retreated, knowing that the exploration was now not only physical, but also ethical and psychological. The labyrinth, until then a challenge of perception and courage, had revealed its true nature, a court of observation and judgment, where every decision could alter not only the investigation, but the perception of reality of anyone who dared to enter. As they left the Hall of Mirrors, Thomas murmured, "I never imagined the house could be so alive." Sarah, her eyes fixed on the documents, replied, "This changes everything. We're not just documenting history, we're witnessing the very essence of those who built it, and we need to decide what to do with this knowledge before the mansion decides for us." The turning point was set. The Winchester Mystery House was not merely a physical labyrinth or a collection of architectural eccentricities. It was sentient, held memories, manipulated perception, and punished or rewarded visitors based on their courage, observation, and intelligence. And the revelation of the mirror brought the team an unexpected understanding. The line between past and present, reality and illusion, would never be the same within that macabre labyrinth. The following morning brought a heavy silence to the Winchester Mystery House. The team, still processing the revelation of the Hall of Mirrors, walked cautiously through the corridors, as if each step could trigger new surprises or reveal another layer of the enigma. The mansion seemed even more alive after the previous night's discovery. Doors closed on their own, creaks echoed at unexpected angles, and shadows stretched in disconcerting ways. Shaken, Thomas began to question whether they should continue. His fear was no longer just physical. He feared his own perception of reality. "I don't know if I can go on," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Yesterday we saw things that shouldn't exist. How can we trust what we see here?" Sarah realized that her investigative obsession was beginning to conflict with the well-being of the group. She took a deep breath and replied firmly, "I understand, Thomas. But we can't back down now. Every discovery brings us closer to understanding the true nature of the mansion. We need to face this together." Internal emotional conflict intensified, creating tension within the team. Dr. Monroe, who had always maintained a rational perspective, now saw that the line between documented history and subjective perception was becoming blurred. He began to question whether his own experience could be trusted. "It's not just architecture or historical memories. The house seems to react to our actions," he said, analyzing the patterns in the hallways. "Every choice we make alters the experience." The consequences of the tipping point weren't limited to the psychological. They also affected the practical dynamics of the exploration. The team realized that certain doors and corridors, which had previously seemed accessible, were now blocked or redirected, as if the mansion were testing their resolve. The map that Sarah had so carefully constructed became partially useless, and each step required meticulous observation, quick thinking, and collaboration. As they progressed, they uncovered another layer of complexity. Old documents indicated that the widow Winchester had planned areas of the mansion to manipulate visitors, forcing them to confront their own fears and ethical decisions. This information intensified the internal conflict of each character. Thomas, who initially trusted his practical experience, felt betrayed by the realization that nothing in the mansion was accidental. Sarah began to question to what extent her curiosity could put everyone at risk, while Dr. Monroe tried to balance logic and intuition. In one of the recently discovered rooms, they found detailed maps of the building, with coded notes about schedules, corridors, and secret doors. Sarah realized that these records indicated that the mansion could only be navigated by those attentive to the patterns and subtleties of the space. But any mistake would result in confusion or danger. The tension increased. Each erratic step could now generate serious consequences, and every decision was tested by the living architecture itself. Beyond the physical pressure, emotional consequences began to manifest. Thomas, once resolute, began to show signs of exhaustion and anxiety. Dr. Monroe struggled to maintain rationality, but the perception of supernatural events implicit in the mansion's memories opened fissures in his scientific conviction. Sarah, though still determined, felt the tension growing internally, realizing that each discovery brought ethical and psychological responsibility. The interactions between the characters also changed. Subtle disputes arose over who should lead the exploration or interpret the mansion's patterns. Small disagreements intensified, but also forced collaboration. Each character needed to trust the others to survive the constantly shifting labyrinth. Human relationships were put to the test. Fear, curiosity, and rationality clashed, revealing layers of personality that were previously invisible. The team began to realize that the mansion not only tested perception and courage, it also imposed ethical and moral consequences. Documents revealed that the widow Winchester manipulated records and spaces to create dilemmas and assess who was worthy of discovering the ultimate secrets. Every action within the house reflected personal choices, and failure could result in permanent confusion or isolation. The narrative tension reached a new level. The exploration of the house was not only physical, but also psychological and moral. At the end of the day, Sarah, Thomas, and Dr. Monroe gathered in a secure room, reflecting on their discoveries and the implications of their recent experiments. The mansion, silent yet still pulsating, seemed to observe their every reaction. They realized that the turning point had transformed the exploration. They were no longer merely investigators of a historical curiosity, but participants in a silent experiment, testing the limits of perception, courage, and ethics. The corridors of the Winchester Mystery House seemed more alive than ever. Each step carried the tension of past experiences, but also a quiet determination. Sarah Whitman realized that the only way to survive and move forward was to learn to adapt to the logic of the mansion, and not simply confront it with willpower or unbridled curiosity. The first step in their growth was accepting that they couldn't control their environment. Thomas, previously reluctant and dominated by fear, began to observe subtle patterns: the rhythm of the creaking doors, the slope of the floor in certain corridors, the direction of the shadows. He began to anticipate the movement of the mansion, adjusting his exploration with patience instead of brute force. Dr. Monroe, in turn, began to accept that the history he was studying was not merely a static record, but that the mansion functioned as a living memory, reacting to human actions. He learned to combine his historical experience with practical observations, allowing clues, codes, inscriptions, and symbols to guide his decisions. Rationality and intuition began to walk hand in hand, creating a new method of understanding the labyrinth. Sarah also evolved. Instead of moving forward alone or pressuring others, she began to listen attentively to Thomas and Monroe, recognizing that each perspective was essential to interpreting the patterns of the mansion. Her leadership became collaborative and strategic. She organized the team into coordinated movements, using detailed records of each corridor and door as a reference. The protagonist ceased to be just a solitary investigator and became part of a collective survival system, learning to balance courage, observation, and empathy. A new challenge arose when they discovered a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly, with no end in sight. Anxiety gripped Thomas, who began to doubt his own perception, but Sarah, remembering the lessons learned, took a deep breath and said, "We need to think in terms of patterns, not size. Let's analyze every detail before moving forward." Following this method, they noticed symbols engraved on the walls, which, when combined with the light coming through the windows, indicated the correct direction. Thomas and Munro, initially skeptical, followed their instructions and together managed to cross the corridor without incident. It was a moment of silent victory, showing that adaptation and collaboration were key to overcoming the challenges of the mansion. The growth also manifested itself in the team's psychological perception. Every shadow, every echo, every moving door ceased to be merely a threat and became information. Fear transformed into alertness, anxiety into focused attention. The Winchester Mystery House remained unpredictable, but the team was evolving to interpret it instead of reacting only emotionally. Another turning point occurred when they discovered a partially flooded room, which seemed to have been designed to confuse the visitor. Water reflected off the corridors, multiplying the sensation of infinite space. Thomas initially hesitated, fearing he would slip or get lost. But Sarah suggested they analyze the reflections as an additional map rather than fearing them. The group began using the water reflections to plot routes, transforming a challenge into a navigation tool. During this exploration, ethical decisions arose that also tested the team's growth. They found documents detailing the accidents and disappearances of previous workers. Instead of simply observing or collecting evidence, Sarah proposed that they carefully record and document everything, avoiding sensationalism. The ethical approach became part of the team's maturity. The knowledge acquired needed to be used responsibly and not just as fuel for fame or fear. With each challenge overcome, the characters showed visible evolution. Thomas learned to control his fear and trust observation. Munro managed to integrate science and intuition, and Sarah transformed into a strategic and empathetic leader. The mansion remained hostile and enigmatic, but the team now possessed the skills, discipline, and cohesion that allowed them to face situations that previously seemed impossible. At the end of the day, gathered in a dimly lit hallway, Sarah reflected on the journey. We're not just uncovering the secrets of the mansion, we're learning to think differently, to observe carefully, and to trust each other. The Winchester Mystery House has tested us, but it has also taught us to overcome our limits. Thomas nodded, visibly calmer. I never imagined that fear could be transformed into a tool. Today we are able to control what once controlled us. Doctor. Munro concluded, and now we understand that the mansion is not just architecture or history, it is an ongoing challenge that requires constant adaptation. The team's growth was consolidated. Each member had undergone a practical and emotional transformation, acquiring skills to face the upcoming obstacles and to interpret the mansion in ways that would have been impossible before. The Winchester Mystery House remained macabre and unpredictable, but the team had evolved from mere explorers to conscious observers, capable of understanding patterns, anticipating dangers, and making strategic decisions with precision. The morning dawned cold and silent, shrouded in a fog that seemed to emanate from the Winchester Mystery House itself. Sarah, Thomas, and Dr. Munro knew they had overcome significant challenges, but what awaited them was still uncertain. The mansion now seemed to observe their actions more closely, adjusting corridors, doors, and shadows, as if responding to the team's newfound courage. The first step in preparing for the climax was to review all previous findings. Sarah spread maps, notes, photos, and diaries on a makeshift table in one of the main rooms. Every explored corridor, every secret door, every coded symbol was recorded. The group realized that the secondary subplots, disappearances of workers, the widow's patterns, reflections in mirrors, now formed a cohesive mosaic. Everything indicated that the mansion possessed a central path, a sequence of rooms and corridors that led to the ultimate truth, to the essence of the labyrinth that the widow Winchester had created. Thomas, more confident after overcoming his initial fear, began to identify patterns in the creaking of doors and the layout of the corridors. He realized that certain doors only opened when they followed synchronized footsteps, indicating that the mansion tested not only observation, but discipline and patience. Each previous failure had served as a learning experience. Now, the team could anticipate subtle changes in the architecture. Dr. Monroe, using his historical knowledge, suggested that the final sequence of rooms was likely linked to the widow's history, her grief, and the decisions that led her to build incessantly. He highlighted that some visual clues and codes in the documents indicated a central, hidden, and protected room that concentrated the widow's memory and obsession. To reach it, it would be necessary to understand the temporal, symbolic, and physical patterns of the mansion. While planning the route, Sarah realized that time pressure remained a critical factor. Sunlight and moonlight, shadow patterns and reflections in mirrors and water could indicate precise moments to access certain doors. She developed a detailed schedule, synchronizing steps, observing symbols, and the direction of the corridors, to ensure that every movement was calculated. The team understood that any mistake could delay them or isolate them in impassable corridors. Emotional tension also reached its peak. Thomas, who had previously doubted himself, now trusted his abilities but felt the weight of responsibility for the team. Dr. Monroe, rational and methodical, was aware that although the path was mapped out, the mansion remained unpredictable, potentially testing not only bodies but also minds and ethical decisions. Sarah, in her role as leader, needed to balance courage, strategy, and empathy, ensuring everyone remained united. Secondary subplots were resolved or integrated into the preparation. Documents concerning the missing workers were studied to understand past security patterns and traps. Codes on mirrors and symbols engraved on doors were deciphered to indicate safe routes. Reflections on soaked floors and mirrors were used as an additional map to guide movement. Each subplot contributed to consolidating the path to the core of the mansion. Before moving forward, the team paused in a room lit by the soft light of dusk. Sarah took a deep breath, looking at Thomas and Monroe. The time has come to apply everything we've learned. Every obstacle we've overcome, every fear we've faced has prepared us for what lies ahead. We need to maintain focus, discipline, and trust in one another. Thomas nodded, adjusting his equipment. There's no room for doubt anymore. The house tested our fear, our perception, our patience. Now we're going to test it back, he said with renewed determination. Dr. Monroe concluded, remember, the essence of the Winchester Mystery House isn't just physical. It's memory, observation, and judgment. Every step we take needs to be conscious. As they approached the central corridor, the mansion seemed to react. Doors creaked softly, shadows lengthened in a way almost synchronized with their steps. It was as if the house was aware that the team finally understood its rules. Every corridor, every reflection, every symbol now served as a guide, no longer as an obstacle, demonstrating that the preparation, learning, and overcoming of previous challenges were essential for the final confrontation. The path to the climax was laid out, but the tension remained high. The Winchester Mystery House, with its macabre and clever architecture, tested the team on every level, physical, emotional, and intellectual. And now the final challenge lay ahead, promising to reveal not only the widow's secrets, but also the strength and evolution of those who dared to traverse its endless corridors. The central corridor of the Winchester Mystery House seemed to stretch to infinity, its black walls reflecting shadows that twisted and multiplied. Each step echoed like a warning, and the air seemed denser, thick with silence and expectation. Sarah Whitman led the team, now fully aware of the mansion's logic. Thomas and Dr. Monroe followed closely, each focused but alert to any sign of anomaly. They finally reached the door that the diaries and symbols indicated as the mansion's core. It was massive, carved with intricate patterns, symbols that seemed to move as the moonlight streamed through the window. Thomas felt a wave of anxiety. It felt like they weren't just about to open a physical door, but to penetrate the very consciousness of the house. Sarah turned the doorknob. The door slowly opened, revealing a circular room illuminated by a spectral light, but without a visible source. In the center, a huge mirror reflected not only the staff, but also a series of past events at the mansion: the incessant construction, the missing workers, the widow Winchester herself in moments of obsession and despair. It was a complete exposé of the house's history and essence, finally revealed. The mansion, until then a silent antagonist, now seemed aware, almost alive. Secondary doors began to open and close. Corridors adjusted in real time. Shadows formed figures that seemed to observe the team's every move. It was the final test. Any misstep could isolate them or confuse them permanently. Sarah took the first step, approaching the mirror. That's when an unexpected twist occurred. The image of the widow, reflected in the mirror, began to interact with them. It wasn't a static reflection, but a presence that seemed to react to the team's emotions and decisions. The figure extended its hand, as if inviting Sarah to fully understand the construction of her life and her obsession. Thomas instinctively recoiled, but Sarah realized that the only way to overcome the mansion was to accept its logic and confront her fears. She stepped forward, lightly touching the mirror. In that instant, a tremor ran through the room, and the shadows intensified, forming images of missing workers, corridors that seemed to multiply, and doors opening in endless sequence. Each member of the team felt the weight of the past, the living memory of the mansion, as if every previous decision was being evaluated. Dr. Monroe perceived the final pattern. The mansion tested courage, perception, and ethics. It wasn't just a physical test, but a psychological one. Every step needed to be conscious, balancing observation and action. Following his lead, the team synchronized their movements, crossing the room and touching strategic points indicated by symbols, combining light, reflection, and position. When they reached the exact center of the room, a shocking revelation occurred. The mirror revealed that the widow Winchester herself had planned every corridor, every secret door, not just as a physical labyrinth, but as a device to test the living. And now they had completed the test. The mansion, which until then had seemed antagonistic, recognized the team's courage, patience, and intelligence, and the illusion began to slowly dissolve. Thomas, still incredulous, murmured, "We did it. She really tested us to the limit." Sarah, observing the mirror, realized the magnitude of their victory. Not only had they survived, but they had learned to interpret and respect the logic of the mansion, transforming fear into strategy, chaos into understanding. Dr. Monroe concluded, "This changes our perception of history. We are not just documenting, we are understanding a consciousness that transcends architecture." The climax reached its peak when the doors began to close slowly, but this time without threat. It was a symbolic conclusion. The mansion recognized that they had deciphered its labyrinth. Each corridor, each symbol, each shadow settled into silence, as if finally accepting the presence of the intruders who had respected its rules. In the final moment, the mirror reflected not only the team, but also a vision of the future. The Winchester Mystery House would remain a mystery and a challenge, but the team now possessed the understanding and courage necessary to tell its story. The personal transformation of each character was complete. Thomas, from insecure and fearful, became an attentive observer. Dr. Monroe, from absolute rationality, integrated intuition and ethics with logic. Sarah, from a solitary investigator, evolved into an empathetic and strategic leader. The final confrontation resolved the central conflict. The mansion, which seemed alive and hostile, revealed its true nature, and the team proved its ability to interpret, survive, and learn. The suspense, psychological terror, and physical tension culminated in an experience that transformed the character's perception and solidified the macabre narrative of the Winchester Mystery House. When the team finally left the heart of the mansion, the feeling of triumph and relief was palpable. Every corridor traversed, every door opened, and every symbol deciphered had culminated in an understanding of the Winchester Mystery House. But the weight of the experiences still lingered. The mansion remained imposing and silent, almost as if acknowledging the courage of those who dared to traverse its labyrinths. Sarah Whitman, now a consolidated and strategically better prepared leader, took a deep breath as she observed Thomas and Dr. Monroe. The experience had transformed them, not just as explorers, but as individuals capable of facing fear, interpreting complex patterns, and acting ethically even in the face of the unknown. Each of them carried invisible scars, memories of endless corridors, deceptive reflections, and the feeling of being watched by a living presence within the architecture. Thomas, once dominated by fear and insecurity, now moved with confidence. He could identify patterns of behavior in the mansion and anticipate subtle changes in the corridors. His courage was no longer merely reaction, but a conscious decision, shaped by the intense experience he had faced. Dr. Monroe, who had always trusted in reason and logic, learned to integrate observation, intuition, and ethics, realizing that not all truth can be captured solely by historical data. The conclusion of the subplots also brought a sense of closure. The records and diaries of the widow Winchester, the disappearances of the workers, and the codes engraved on doors and mirrors were carefully documented. Sarah decided that the knowledge gained would be shared responsibly, without sensationalism, respecting the memory of those who had been victims and preserving the complexity of the mansion as a historical and psychological enigma. The Winchester Mystery House remained a place of mystery and fascination. Although the team had deciphered its central labyrinth, there was a feeling that new layers might still exist. Unmapped corridors, uninterpreted reflections, hidden symbols that might remain invisible to any observer who wasn't paying attention. However, the central narrative had been resolved. The conflict between curiosity, fear, and understanding had found its equilibrium, and the team emerged victorious, transformed by the experience. As they walked toward the exit, the twilight illuminated the irregular facades of the mansion. Each shadow now seemed less threatening, reflecting not danger, but the complexity of a construction that tested intelligence, patience, and courage. The feeling of victory was accompanied by respect. The Winchester Mansion, with its infinite architecture and implicit awareness, had offered a unique and unforgettable challenge. Sarah, looking at the maps that recorded each corridor and each symbol, murmured, "We managed to understand the essence of the house. We survived, learned, and grew, and in a way, it also allowed us to learn from it." Thomas smiled slightly. "I never thought that learning through fear would be so intense, but now I know we can do it." Dr. Monroe concluded, "The mansion is more than just bricks and wood. It's memory, experience, and living history. Today, we witnessed something unique. The team left the mansion, taking with them not only historical records, but also profound lessons about courage, observation, and collaboration. Each step out of the house represented the consolidation of personal growth, an understanding of the mansion's patterns, and respect for the memory of Widow Winchester. The conclusion was not merely the physical departure, but the realization that they had faced a challenge that transcended architecture, history, and fear, transforming them forever. Months later, Sarah was reviewing the records of the Winchester Mystery House, now carefully published to preserve both the history and the mystery of the mansion. Thomas dedicated himself to guiding young explorers, sharing lessons about courage and observation. Dr. Monroe wrote articles that combined history and psychological insight, reflecting on the implicit consciousness of architecture. And although the mansion remained silent, those who dared to cross its corridors would occasionally feel a passing chill or a distant creak, a subtle reminder that the Winchester Mystery House remained alive, watching and guarding its secrets for those who dared to explore next. If you felt chilled, intrigued, or inspired by the journey through the Winchester Mystery House, share your impressions in the comments. Tell us which discovery in the mansion surprised you the most and how you would react if you were in the endless corridors of the Widow Winchester. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other true and macabre stories, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Each story brings mysteries, suspense, and lessons, and your participation helps keep alive the memory of places and people who defy the impossible.